Happy Arvo. Thank you for joining me. How you guys doing? Especially you, Barry. Barry suggested this. Why Perth is the opposite of every Australian city. It's an interesting title. Very intriguing, actually. I'm not even exactly sure what that means. It is an Australian city. How can it be the opposite? Check out Aussie Atlas. Link down below. Let's do it.
In city, Perth looks like just another Australian city. Beaches, sunshine, coffee shops, AFL football. But there is one invisible line that separates Perth from every single other major city on this continent.
One invisible line. Okay.
And once you see it, you cannot unsee it.
I was trying to think of what it could be. I'm not smart enough.
Because while Sydney faces east toward the Pacific, while Melbourne sits at the cultural heart of the country, while Brisbane, Adelaide and Canberra all orbit the same gravitational centre, Perth is doing something completely different. Perth is facing the other way entirely. And that is not a metaphor. Today, you are about to discover why Perth is one of the most geographically, economically, culturally and politically isolated major cities on Earth.
You know, that is an interesting point, because I've never thought of it as like considering how isolated Australia is and then how isolated Perth is. I've only ever thought of, Australia's quite isolated. And then within Australia, Perth is quite isolated. But when you put it in a bigger frame, Perth is very, very isolated, which is pretty interesting for a big city. Definitely interesting, raises some interesting questions on how it even exists, and how it's even sustainable.
The most geographically, economically, culturally, and politically isolated major cities on Earth.
Because even just getting resources to Perth within Australia must take a long time.
And why the story of how it got that way will completely change the way you think about Australia.
I'm just curious. I don't know if he'll say this, but I want to know the population of Perth. I'm going to guess 2 million. 2.2 million. Now I want to know Australian cities by population. I don't know. I don't know what. So let's see here. I guess that is kind of what this is the greater area, though. I guess that works. Melbourne is number 1. Oh, wait, no, these aren't sorted. Sydney is number 1, but Melbourne is right there. Then a big drop off. Wow, those have a third of the entire Australian population, just those two cities. That is pretty remarkable. Interestingly, Perth's land area is much smaller than Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane. I would have thought it would be bigger since it's over there in giant Western Australia by itself.
People assume that Australia is just
still a gigantic city, of course.
One country with one story. A sunburnt land of beaches and bush, connected from coast to coast. But here is the thing nobody tells you. There are really two Australias. There is the Australia the world knows. Sydney's harbour, Melbourne's laneways, the Great Barrier Reef, and then there is Perth. A city so far removed from the rest of the...
And Darwin. I mean, that's kind of how I think of it, to be honest. I think of, all the cities in the bottom right. Perth and Darwin.
Country that it operates in a different time zone.
But Darwin is nowhere near as big.
Is a different economic air. Looks out at a different ocean. And once voted to leave the Federation altogether. And Perth is, without question, one of the most extraordinary examples I have ever found. So in this video...
And of course, Tas. You can't forget about Tasmania.
I am going to walk you through 5 reasons why Perth is the opposite of every other Australian city. Starting with the one most people never even consider. Think about the last time you drove to a nearby city. Perhaps it took 2 hours, maybe 4. Now imagine driving for 3 days through a flat, treeless desert so vast that the road runs in a perfectly straight line for nearly 150 kilometers without a single bend. That road is the Air Highway. and it is the main road connection between Perth and the rest of Australia's populated east.
That is remarkable, huh? Because it's also like, you know what that makes me think of? Autonomous cars, you know? Like self-driving cars obviously have gotten pretty good, but they're still not perfect. But like, if you put it on this road, it's good enough, you know? You could totally have self-driving trucks that just go across this whole freaking highway. I don't know if I would want one coming at me, but, you know, you'd probably be safe.
The Nullarbor Plain, from the Latin nullus arbor meaning no trees, is not just a distance. It is a geological and psychological barrier. It is pre-human, ancient, and indifferent.
Wow.
Geologists know the plain itself as an uplifted limestone sea
That is so cool.
floor of Miocene age, laid across one of the oldest and most tectonically stable parts of the Australian continent. And it sits between Perth and the rest of civilization like a moat around a castle. Perth is one of the most isolated major cities on the planet. Not in the developing world, not on a remote island. On a continent with a modern road network and one of the highest standards of living on Earth. The nearest comparable city is Adelaide.
God, the bridges in Australia are just freaking gorgeous. It looks like a roller coaster.
Is Adelaide.
The architecture in Australia is gorgeous.
Over 2,100 kilometers away by air. That is roughly the same as flying from London to Moscow.
To Moscow? Holy crap. That puts it into perspective. Just how tightly packed Europe is, but also how gigantic Australia is. London to Moscow?
When I first traced that distance on a map with my finger, I had to stop and look again. Because it did not feel real. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide clustered together in the southeast like a family around a table. Perth sits alone at the other end of the house, in a room of its own, looking out a different window entirely. But here is the thing. That isolation is not just a geographical accident. It created a political identity so distinct from the rest of Australia that in 1933, the people of Western Australia decided they had had enough. And what happened next is one of the most extraordinary events in modern democratic history.
So Western Australia is the Texas of Australia. Yeah.
In April of 1933, the people of Western Australia voted in a lawfully held referendum to secede from the Australian Federation. Not in a narrow protest vote, not by a thin margin, by a margin of 2-1. 68% of voters said, "We want out." Think about what that actually means. This was a functioning democracy. In a modern country in which a supermajority of citizens voted to dissolve their membership of their own nation. The roots of that vote ran deep into the soil of geography. Western Australia had joined the Federation in 1901 as the last and most reluctant state. From the very beginning, Perth felt the weight of federalism pressing down on it in ways the East Coast never did. Tariffs designed to protect manufacturing industries in Victoria and New South Wales made imported goods far more expensive for Western Australians, who had no...
Interesting. That's so interesting. Wow. That's magnificent. Just to think. Yeah, it's remarkable. It's just so interesting how policies in one area, you know, have such massive repercussions to people. These people, something about them being so far away, you know, they're like, we've got nothing to do with your jobs over there. It's London to Moscow. That's how far away you guys are. I mean, you guys are all Australians, which is interesting how cohesive the culture really is. But it's so far away, especially in this time. You know, back when I guess it was more separate culturally. And they're like, yeah, your tariffs are screwing us over here, dude. We want to import some stuff.
A comparable manufacturing base of their own. The vast wealth flowing out of WA's goldfields and pastoral stations drained...
Because it's so far away, it's like Perth has to import stuff from Australia. You know what I mean? Importing stuff all the way to Perth from Sydney, Melbourne, costs a lot of money. So Perth is over here like, you know, we want to import some cheaper stuff from other countries because it costs a lot of money to get it all the way over here. This is just interesting. Oh.
Eastward. And the returns, many felt, never came back west in equal measure. By the time the Great Depression arrived, 3 decades of resentment had reached a boiling point. The secession petition was formally sent to the British Parliament in London, where it was ultimately turned away because the constitutional process did not allow a single Australian state to unpick federation through petition alone. The legal door was closed, but the sentiment it revealed never fully disappeared. A secession movement, colloquially known as Wexit, resurfaces in Western Australia to this day.
Wow.
Whenever the economic balance
It really does have a lot of similarities to Texas. Obviously, a totally different country, totally different history, totally. I'm not trying to be, typical. Oh, Americans viewing everything through the lens of America. I just, I am American, so I do kind of do that. Have to do it. And it is similar. Pretty interesting. It's also a gigantic land. Texas is the biggest state by far. Well, is Alaska bigger than Texas? U.S. states by land area. And I don't want to tuck out my butt. I could be just like freaking totally wrong, man. Oh my gosh. This is why I look stuff up, man. Look at that. Alaska's way bigger than Texas. But then it's a huge drop off from Texas to California. 600,000 square. I kind of forgot about them for a minute, to be honest. It's kind of like the Tasmania of USA, Sorry, Taz. Sorry, Alaskans.
favorably. I remember
No Alaskans are watching this.
standing in the Perth city centre, looking up at the clean lines of its modern skyline and thinking about that vote. This is a city that once looked at the country it belonged to and said, not good enough. That is not Sydney's story. That is not Melbourne's. That is Perth's alone. And the reason that independent identity persists today, the reason Perth still feels like a different country within a country, comes down to something most people completely overlook.
So does Texas.
Something that affects every business call, every broadcast, every early morning message from an East Coast relative. Perth does not just exist in a different place. It exists in a different time. Australia has multiple time zones, but no divide is more quietly disruptive than the one between Perth and the East Coast. Perth runs on Australian Western Standard Time, UTC +8, which places it 2 hours behind Sydney and Melbourne in winter, and 3 hours behind during daylight saving season on the East Coast. This might sound like a minor inconvenience, but consider what it means in practice every single day. When the opening bell rings on the Australian Securities Exchange at 10 in the morning in Sydney, Perth is still only at 8, or 7 during the East Coast daylight saving season.
Well, it sounds like they kind of set that time with Perth in mind. Or they're all just sleeping in on the East Coast, because 10 a.m. is pretty freaking late.
When the East Coast is already deep into its workday, Perth is often only just getting started. Live television broadcasts and national news bulletins built around East Coast schedules do not always land naturally in the West.
This randomly reminds me of Mythbusters. They would film it, and then I guess, I don't know why the turnaround was so fast, but I love the show Mythbusters. I assume you guys know what that is. It's such an iconic show. Even though it's an American show, I feel like it's everywhere. But, yeah, they would send it over to Australia at night. They would film during the day in the States and then send it over to Australia at night. They'd be waking up and they'd edit it and send a preview back to the producers over here in the States. Pretty cool.
National sporting finals shown live from the East Coast often reach Perth much earlier in
So even though those time discrepancies often, are not good, sometimes it's useful.
the day, giving Western viewers a very different experience of supposedly national events. And Western Australia has said no to changing this. In referendums held in 1975, 1984, 1992, and most recently in 2009, each time rejecting the adoption of daylight saving time. Every time the question is put to the people, the West votes to stay in its own rhythm. Not because Western Australians fail to understand the inconvenience, but because Perth has always kept its own time, in every sense of the phrase. And if you want to truly understand why, You need to look at what Perth is actually facing, because while every other major Australian city turns toward the Pacific, toward the east, toward the trading routes that built the nation, Perth is doing the opposite, literally. Stand on Cottesloe Beach at sunset and watch the sun drop below the horizon into the Indian Ocean. Now think about where you are in the world. The light fading in front of you is falling toward Africa, toward Madagascar, Mauritius, the Mozambique Channel.
This is getting very sort of philosophical.
Not toward New Zealand, not toward the Pacific. Perth is the only major Australian capital city that faces west.
I imagine this is how Alaskans feel. I've been comparing it to Texas a lot, but in Alaska, they're so isolated. That's the similar. That's probably the actual, even more similar to Western Australia is Alaska, other than the weather. It's huge, it's remote, it's isolated. They definitely have their own culture up there.
Every other significant population centre in the country, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide among them, is tied far more closely to the southern and eastern rim of the continent, historically oriented toward the trade routes and geopolitical relationships that shaped modern Australia. Perth looks out at an ocean that the rest of the country barely thinks about. The winds that cool Perth on a blazing summer afternoon, a famous afternoon sea breeze that locals have named the Fremantle Doctor, arrive from the southwest off the Indian Ocean, bringing relief after the inland heat of the day. There is no other major city in the country where that sea breeze is so central to the local identity. Perth averages more than 3,000 hours of sunshine per year. More than Sydney, more than Melbourne, more than Brisbane. Because its latitude, its climate system, and its ocean exposure belong to a city in a completely different part of the world. If you lifted Perth off the map and placed it on a globe without labels, you would reach for Cape Town. You would think of Casablanca. You would not think of Australia. And it is this westward orientation, this Indian Ocean identity, that shapes the final and perhaps most quietly powerful way Perth differs from
That's a really cool little island thing.
every other Australian city. Because the ground Perth is standing on is not the same ground the rest of Australia is standing on. And the economy it built reflects that completely. While Sydney is a city of finance and services, while Melbourne trades in culture, education and professional industries, while the big East Coast capitals built much of their modern prosperity on immigration,
Western Australia is, obviously mining is gigantic in Australia. But I think it's really paramount in Western Australia, right?
tourism, finance, education and a diversified services economy. Perth built its wealth on what lies beneath the earth.
Because I remember when you guys lost that radioactive little pill, I believe that was in Western Australia.
Western Australia sits on one of the most mineral-rich geological formations on the planet. Iron ore from the Pilbara, gold from Kalgoorlie, natural gas from the offshore fields of the Northwest Shelf. These resources have made Western Australia the engine of Australian export income, at times generating well over a third of the country's total export revenue. But resource economies do not behave like services economies. They do not gradually grow. They boom and they crash. They inflate and they deflate with a violence that services cities never experience. During the great mining boom of the 2000s, Perth was transformed. Its skyline rose. House prices surged faster than any other city in Australia.
Wow.
Workers flew in from the East Coast on fly-in, fly-out schedules that became their own subculture. Thousands of men and women living half their lives in a mining camp in the Pilbara and the other half back in a suburb of a city they rarely saw in daylight. Cranes stood on every corner. And then, when commodity prices fell, the air came out. Perth's property market declined while Sydney and Melbourne continued to rise.
That is funny to think of. I never thought about that. It's just interesting how their whole economy, the basis, the denominator of their whole economy is like these commodity prices. Which, it's probably not the most volatile commodity prices, but some of them are. And regardless, you're still going to have commodity prices that do fluctuate quite a lot, like he's saying. So that's just great. It's just interesting to think, you can almost wake up one day and it's like, the GDP expectations went down 5% today,
Its economy slowed while the East Coast barely registered the change. I have walked through Perth neighbourhoods that tell this story in the architecture alone.
Or they went up.
Freshly built house next to a weatherboard from the 1970s, a gleaming glass tower 3 blocks from a row of shuttered shop fronts. It is a city written by boom and bust in a way that no other Australian city quite is. Because no other Australian city is standing on the same ground, pointing at the same horizon, built on the same ancient and violently productive geology.
I think that mines are so cool looking.
Perth looks like just another Australian city, and in some ways it is. It has the beaches, it has the sunshine, it has the coffee. But beneath the surface, in the geology, the history, the politics, the time zone, the economy, and the very direction the city faces, Perth is something else entirely. It is a city that has always lived by its own rules, a city that voted to leave its own country and took that case all the way to London, only to find the constitutional door closed. A city that keeps its own time because it has always known it exists somewhere different. A city standing at the edge of the continent facing an ocean the rest of Australia does not see. Built on wealth that rises and falls by forces no city can fully control. Perth was never supposed to be like everywhere else. It has the isolation of a place that forged its own identity, not despite the geography surrounding it, but because of it. And the longer you look at it, the more you realise the line that separates Perth from every other Australian city was never drawn on a map. It was drawn in the rock, the wind, the tide, and the deep, stubborn independence of a city that has always been pointing
It's like Pocahontas.
somewhere the rest of the country cannot quite see. If this changed the way you see Australia, if you found yourself thinking about a city you had perhaps never quite seen clearly before, then you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for.
All right. Well, that certainly was fascinating. And it had a very hypnotic vibe. It almost like made me sleepy, but it was very interesting. The music, I think. It's like... That was really quite fascinating, though, just because I never... It's like I've heard all the pieces separately, but putting them all together, it's like, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. Plus some information I didn't know. I didn't know Perth voted to secede. 2-1. Or Western Australia. Wexit. Imagine if Australia was 2 countries. It's definitely a big enough continent to be 2 countries. That would be weird. All right. Thank you for watching, guys. Thanks for suggesting that, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.